Storyteller's Thread, a monthly podcast devoted to young adult literature and the art of storytelling. I'm your host, Sean Connors. On each episode, we invite an author for young adults to take us inside their work, and in doing so, to talk about their writing process, their inspiration for writing for young readers, and the general ins and outs of earning a living as a professional storyteller. So, whether you're a compulsive reader, an aspiring writer, a teacher or librarian, or simply a frustrated reader who's counting the hours until you get home and dive back into that novel that's waiting for you on your nightstand, this is the place for you. Hey everyone, it's November 1st, 2019. Man, am I the only one who feels like fall just got started and already it's ending? I don't know, maybe I'm in denial, or maybe I just don't want to accept the winter's around the corner. So let me get started by thanking you for tuning into this plucky little podcast. Believe it or not, it's been on the air for just over a year now, and like the little engine that could, it just keeps plugging along. My guest this month is Cory Doctorow, and as a science fiction dystopia geek, I'm particularly excited to share this conversation with you. If you're not familiar with Cory's work, he may well be the busiest writer in America. In fact, he may be the busiest person in America, and I'm not kidding. In addition to writing science fiction and dystopia for adults and young adults, Doctorow is the co-editor of the weblog Boing Boing and a popular blogger as well. He's also a technology activist, and amongst his many commitments, he serves as a consultant to the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a nonprofit civil liberties group that defends freedom in technology law, policy, standards, and treaties. Doctorow holds an honorary doctorate in computer science from the Open University in the United Kingdom, where he's a visiting professor. And as though that weren't enough, he's an MIT Media Lab research affiliate and a visiting professor of practice at the University of South Carolina's School of Library and Information Science. In the realm of young adult fiction, Doctorow is arguably best known for his Little Brother series. The first book, Little Brother, is inspired by George Orwell's 1984 and tells the story of a group of teenagers whose lives are radically changed in the wake of a terrorist attack on San Francisco. When the Department of Homeland Security arrives and begins using technology to track and surveil people, essentially turning the city into a police state, the protagonist and his friends decide to fight back using their own technological know-how. Little Brother was nominated for the Hugo Award in 2008, and in 2013, Doctorow published a sequel, Homeland. His other books for young adults include Pirate Cinema, For the Win, and a graphic novel, In Real Life. In addition to writing science fiction for young adults, Doctorow also writes sci-fi for adults, and his most recent novel, Radicalized, came out just this year. Between writing, traveling, consulting, commenting on topics related to technology, and speaking to international audiences, I have no idea when Cory sleeps, or if he does sleep, so I was beyond excited when he agreed to sit down and talk with me about his work. I hope you enjoy our conversation. In my experience, I found that people who are interested in science fiction can often point to a person or persons who introduced them to the genre and supported their entering the sci-fi fandom. Who was that person for you? Do you recall?
There are a couple of entry points that really mattered in terms of my own development. One was my dad, who was, a big science fiction fan. And when my mom was going to teacher's college, we would stay home in the evenings and he would watch Doctor Who with me. And in those days, Doctor Who was in Ontario. It aired on our public broadcaster, TVO, where it would be introduced every week by Judith Merrill, who is one of the great titans of the field. Judy was an editor and writer and critic, and she had been married to Frederick Pohl, another very prominent writer of her era. And after the 2008 police riots in Chicago, she decided to go effectively into voluntary exile with their kids. She couldn't bear the thought of living in the U.S. anymore, given what had just happened. And so, among other things, she became a TV commentator. And every week when Doctor Who aired, she would explain how that Doctor Who episode fit into the wider context of the history of science fiction. And sometimes she had been in the Futurian house when some writer or another had actually invented the trope that was now being explored in that. And then as I grew up, Judy continued to play a really important role in my life. She established with her personal collection the science fiction reference collection at the Toronto Public Library, which was then called the Spaced Out Library. When she died, they renamed it the Merrill Collection. She wouldn't let them name it after her while she was alive. And she served as writer in residence. And so you could bring her manuscripts and she would critique them. And so from a very early age, as a tween, I was bringing her stories that she was critiquing. And one of the things that she was always looking out for is writers who seemed compatible, and she would put them together in writing workshops. And that's how I ended up in a group that's still going called the Cecil Street Irregulars that includes people like Peter Watts and Carl Schrader and David Nichol and Madeline Ashby. At the same time, there was a science fiction bookstore in Toronto, the oldest science fiction bookstore remaining in the world, which is called Baca Books. And again, at the age of 9 or 10, I went there on a school trip, and it was always a place where writers worked as they were trying to get their career off the ground. And the woman behind the counter that day was a writer named Tanya Huff, who had yet to sell her first story. And Tanya quizzed me on what kind of books I liked, and then took me back into the used section and found me a $1 copy of H. Beam Piper's Little Fuzzy. It was the first book I ever bought for myself with my own money. And Tanya would also critique my manuscripts when I brought them down to the store. And about 10 years later, when she quit to write full time, I got her job and went to work at the store. So it was an amazing thing to grow up in a city that had as close to a formal science fiction apprenticeship as you could hope for. And there's more I could talk about. We had a TV show on TV Ontario called Prisoners of Gravity that I was a consultant to. And Judith Merrill did these 6 times a year potluck dinners called Hydra. That was based on these New York dinners that the Futurian House used to do, where we would gather at different people's houses and pay a modest entry fee to pay for the beer. And every writer and editor and librarian and critic and academic who was working in the field would gather together, and it made for a very solid community.
It seems like science fiction is a genre that people either love or they hate. What's your argument for the genre's value? Why should people read science fiction?
You know, I don't meet a lot of people who hate science fiction these days, although I guess that's partly due to self-selection. But, you know, like literally in my life, the circles I've run in, I've just never really encountered that formal prejudice against the field. My case for why science fiction matters, I guess at its best, science fiction is a kind of emotional fly-through, like an architect's rendering of what it might feel like to live under a technological regime before that regime arrives, to let us start to develop a critical vocabulary for what we might want and what we might fear about technological events that are on our horizon. And at the same time, it acts as a kind of oracle, not of the future, but of the present. You know, if you want to know what a science fiction writer is worried about and hopeful for, look at the stories they're telling. If you want to know what our society is hopeful for and fearful of, look at the stories that we're paying attention to. And, you know, this question of where our technology will lead us in terms of our social and economic structures, it's one of the most urgent questions we have. It is bound up intimately with things like climate change and gender justice and wealth inequality and racial inequality and so on.
You published your first young adult novel, Little Brother, in 2008. Prior to that, you'd written fiction for adults, including Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom and Someone Comes to Town, Someone Leaves Town. What motivated you to try your hand at writing fiction for teenagers? Do you recall?
You know, there was a series of motivations. One was that I started to connect with colleagues who were doing it. For example, Kathy Koja, who's this wonderful horror writer who lives just outside of Detroit, came out to speak to some of my students when I was teaching at the Clarion Science Fiction Workshop back when it was at Michigan State University in East Lansing. And she described the pleasures she'd had when she reinvented herself as a young adult writer, and specifically how consequential it was to write YA, how, you know, adults might read for pleasure, but kids read to figure out how the world works. And that certainly jived with my recollection of my reading experience. And then I ran into other writers like Scott Westerfeld and Justine Larbalestier, who were writing science fiction for young adults. And they really, you know, they reiterated some of that with their own spin on it. And then at the National Science Fiction Convention in Australia around 2006 or 7, when I was a guest of honor, I met a young adult writer, and I don't know who. I used to think it was Garth Nix, and I asked him, and he said, no, that definitely wasn't me. So I met some Australian young adult writer who said that they think that the thing that drives science fiction for young adults or young adult fiction more generally is that there is a kind of built-in dramatic mechanism to YA fiction in that people doing things for the first time without knowing quite how they'll turn out is intrinsically dramatic. If you've never told a lie of consequence and then you tell that lie of consequence, you don't know if these wings of wax that you fashioned are going to support you as you jump off the cliff, or they're going to be dashed to your death when you hit the bottom. And the only way to find out is to jump off and see what happens. Now, telling a lie of consequence for the 1,000th time is just banal, right? It makes you a sociopath, right? But telling it for the first time is incredible. And, this is, of course, why so much young adult science fiction have these virginity loss scenes as their both literal and figurative climax, because each one of these is a kind of virginity loss. You're going through a doorway, and when you pass through it, you can never pass back, right? You become a different person. And so all of that together really combined. And, I have such fond memories of the YA that was really important to me, particular writers like Daniel Pinkwater, who really kind of made me the person I am today. So it was very exciting to kind of revisit that mode of storytelling.
I'd like to pick up on a point that you just made regarding how young adult literature is viewed in the larger culture. In 2011, you published an essay in your book Context in which you argued that, and I'm quoting you here, the lack of regard for YA fiction in the mainstream isn't an altogether bad thing. You went on to state, there's something to be said for living in a disreputable, ghettoized Bohemia. Can you talk about that? How does young adult literature's marginalization constitute a potential affordance writers can capitalize on?
Well, it's not dissimilar to science fiction. Science fiction had this long period of disrespectability in which you had writers like Rod Serling or even Judith Merril who were telling very sharp and pointed political allegories that would have been beyond the pale in the mainstream of literature, who were able to smuggle these in. If you look back at the moral panic over comic books, the seduction of the innocents panic, what you find is this kind of shock discovery on the part of kind of blue-nosed moralizers that all of the ideas they thought they had stamped out of the mainstream were thriving in this ill-regarded corner of the literary world that, despite its disreputability and its lack of attention from the mainstream of culture, was nevertheless hugely culturally significant, right? It was both underground and wildly popular, which is quite a combination. And YA was like that as well. I think less so these days, in part, because of the things that drove the YA Renaissance, things like J.K. Rowling, which drove a lot of adult attention to these books. And, it's not a coincidence that Fan Book Week focused on YA literature a couple of years ago, because it is one of the most contested categories now in libraries and schools, because parents have twigged to the fact, or, the kind of parents who want to stamp out a certain kind of portrayal of sexuality or drugs or any other so-called controversial subject, that they've twigged to the fact that YA is where this stuff was getting smuggled in.
In the same essay that I alluded to a moment ago, you note that although adults and young adults both read for entertainment, teenagers also read to discover how the world works. And that realization leads you to argue that, and I'm going to quote you, there's a consequentiality to writing for young people that makes the work immensely satisfying. What do you mean when you say that there's a consequentiality to writing for young adults?
So one of my favorite writers is a guy named Stephen Bruce. And Bruce's got many aphorisms, but the one I often turn to is that telling someone they wrote a bad book is like telling someone they've got an ugly kid. Even if it's true, they presumably did everything they could to prevent it, and it's too late for them to change it now. But, the exception to this is kids who talk to you about your books. Because when a kid comes up to you and says, I disagree with this thing in your book, it's not because they lack social graces. It's because they took it really seriously. And they want to talk to you about the way that serious regard ran up against their own lived experience or beliefs. And so, I will always make an exception for a kid who wants to tell me that they didn't like my books, because they're not bringing that up just to be offensive. They're bringing it up because they want me to help them figure out how the world works.
Can you talk about how your recognition of the consequentiality for writing for young adults shapes how you approach writing for a teenage audience?
Well, it certainly imbues it with a certain significance. You wanna be careful about what you say and how you say it and what messages you're sending. I think there is a conundrum among those of us in the free expression movement. I count myself as one of them, because there's a kind of reductionist thumbnail of our argument that says it's just words. You shouldn't censor it because words aren't deeds, and therefore they are harmless. And while words are not deeds, I would be the last person to call words harmless. I write words because they matter, not because they don't. And the idea that books can't influence people, or that influence shouldn't be part of how we think about the world, is not right. I think it's a really serious error that we make to characterize our work as so insignificant as to not be worthy of the kind of scrutiny that it gets. I think there's much better arguments about, the legitimacy of what you're trying to say. The legitimacy, for example, of exposing children to sexuality as a way of getting them to think critically about something that's a very big part of the lives that they're coming to. There's an amazing story about Judy Blume that, although all of her books are as they were when they were published, the one exception is Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, which is also one of the most challenged books in her canon. And every couple of years, she rewrites that book, not to address the concerns of parents, but to make sure that the stuff about how menstruation products work is up to date, because of the number of readers who told her, readers who, were assigned female at birth, readers with uteruses and periods, who tell her that the way that they discovered that they were going to have a period and what to do when it came was by reading that book, right? That is an awesome responsibility. My kind of microcosmic version of that is the number of people who've come up to me and said, the reason I became an information security professional, the reason I work in tech is because of Little Brother. And my hope is, one of the things that I comfort myself with in The Long Watches the Night is that these people are approaching a very important field with an ethical center that comes out of my explicit decision to make Little Brother something of a polemic about what technology can promise you if it's in your control, and what technology takes away from you if it's used to control you.
You've given me a perfect stepping off point. I'd like to shift gears and talk about Little Brother, which was your first novel for young adults. For listeners who haven't read it, though, could you give an overview of what the book's about?
Sure. Little Brother is a book about high schoolers in San Francisco who are out playing hooky one day when a terrorist attack blows up the Bay Bridge. And almost immediately, the city is transformed into a kind of police state as the Department of Homeland Security becomes an occupying army that reworks the city around a series of checkpoints and surveillance measures that are designed nominally to catch terrorists, but really are a kind of authoritarian playbook that was clearly written long before the attacks and put on a shelf against the day that there would be a rubric to deploy it. And these young people, so aghast are they at this changes in their world and at the willingness of the adults around them to be kind of credulous about the need for these changes, that they create a kind of guerrilla army in which they use a network of hacked Xboxes to have cryptographically secured conversations that the NSA can't eavesdrop on. And they use that to plan and execute a guerrilla ouster of the DHS from San Francisco and a restoration of the Bill of Rights.
In the past couple of years, books like Angie Thomas's The Hate U Give have generated a considerable amount of interest in youth activism.
Mm-hmm.
But you've been writing about teenagers as activists since 2008 with Little Brother. What inspires you to write about that topic, young people using technology to advocate for themselves and their communities?
Well, I was one of those people. I was a young activist, grew up in an activist household. The first publicly available software I ever wrote was a quiz on nuclear disarmament that I wrote to be displayed at a kiosk at a folk festival in, I think, 1989 81 or 82 when I was about 10 years old. And, I helped create early mailing lists to coordinate activist action and often, found myself arguing with fellow activists about the appropriateness of focusing on technology as an activist tool. There was this sense that it was a distraction and even untrustworthy, that technology was the tool of the man. And that if you were going to be serious about addressing the oppression that was systemic and around us, that you had to be dismantling technology, not celebrating it. But at the same time, there was this countercurrent in activism and technology, embodied in many ways by the Whole Earth catalog and by its digital successor, the Whole Earth Electronic Link, or the WELL, which was a BBS that I got onto when I was a kid. And, this idea that we could, even as the technology was aborting, create a new radical praxis for it was very exciting to me. And also, a thing that I wanted to illustrate so that my colleagues in activist causes could understand what I meant when I said that we couldn't afford to ignore this stuff. And, in some ways I feel very vindicated by this. I had an experience a couple of years ago at Comic-Con where I ran into a friend of mine who is an activist who I had kind of lost touch with after a very acrimonious dinner that we'd had around 2007, in which they had opined that worrying about technology was a kind of fool's errand and a distraction, a very kind of Malcolm Gladwell argument, right? That civil rights battles were won with shoe leather and with facing down, police dogs, and not with messing around on the internet. And this person cornered me at a Comic-Con a couple of years ago, maybe it was last summer, and said, I wanted to tell you how important the work that you're doing is to me and how significant I think it is. And I feel like we're finally winning that battle, right? I think that we're finally understanding that it's important to, we finally have this public understanding that it's important to think about these technologies as more than e-commerce and as more than tools for socializing, but instead as important tools for affecting social change, and also important means by which social change could be held back if we don't attend to them and take control of them.
I'd love to dig into that a little more. I read a lot of YA science fiction and a lot of YA dystopia. And when you look at those genres, especially the books that are commercially successful, I do often feel as though technology continues to be represented as this oppressive force. And you're one of a small number of writers that I can think of for young adults who, while you acknowledge that potential, you do paint a more empowering picture of the ways in which people can use technology. So I'm curious, when you look at the larger culture, where do you see evidence that maybe we are beginning to move beyond those concerns about tech that you just alluded to?
I think that, like, when you look at the techlash, which is, this sense that the tech companies are in a really, bad place in terms of how they interact with kind of human thriving, how they become de facto arms of oppressive states, and so on. You also find within it this tacit acknowledgement that technology really matters, right? So, the early dismissals of technology as part of an activist toolkit were centered in the idea that technology just didn't matter, that it was a distraction. That's that infamous Malcolm Gladwell essay, that you're just wasting your time, that, trying to express your argument in 140 or 280 character bytes is a fool's errand that will always lead you astray. People like Evgeny Morozov have made this argument as well. And now in the techlash, we have this sense that it actually really, really does matter, but maybe that it's too late to do anything about it. And this is a kind of common pattern. I call it the peak denial or peak indifference moment, where if you have a legitimate problem, if there's something wrong in the world and you can't convince people to do anything about it and they just insist that it's not a problem, over time, because the problem is real, it will become more manifest and harder to deny, that it will just become like a fact in people's lives. People's lives will be destroyed by our failure to address it. Climate change would be another example of the inability to address this problem as a result of a paralysis brought about by denial and indifference eventually kind of cures itself, because eventually we get to a point where it's just obvious that this is a problem. And the reason it's obvious is because your life was destroyed by our failure to address it. The reason it's obvious is that your house just burned down, or was flooded out, or that your country is riven by a refugee crisis driven by climate change. And, at the moment in which people start to self-radicalize, at the moment in which people start to convince themselves that peak indifference moment, when the indifference only goes down from now on, no matter what anyone says or does, there's this moment where denial slides into nihilism, right? Where people go from not thinking that there is a problem to not thinking that there's anything that can be done about it. And, a thumbnail sketch of that in terms of, say, climate change and ecology might be that, for years and years, I try to get you to care that rhino populations are crashing. And then finally, you wake up one day and you say, well, all right, there's only one rhino left. Clearly, there was a problem. But since there's only one rhino left, we might as well find out what he tastes like. And that's, I think, where we've got to with the techlash, right? That we now are finally waking up and saying this stuff matters, but we're not saying there's a solution to it. And that's where I think, the people who are in my milieu have a role to play, which is in articulating a positive technological future, one in which people are masters of their technical destiny. One that's not just about this will be terrible if we screw it up, but about how great it will be if we don't. And, there's some of that around the periphery, and I see it growing more in our discourse. Certainly the Parkland kids and so on, that if you ask them, is technology a net positive or a net negative for your organizing? They're not going to tell you, well, I wish that we'd been running our gun control campaign by, photocopying posters and wheat pasting them to telephone poles. This is an activist mentality that's totally bound up with the internet.
I want to touch on that point you just made, and I want to talk about the teenagers that you write about. The teenagers in your books are typically highly intelligent, highly capable, politically astute people. In fact, rereading your books in preparation for a conversation, I found myself thinking that in many ways, the characters you write about resemble real-life teenagers like Greta Thunberg, the teenage activist whose efforts to call attention to global warming have inspired millions of people, or, as you mentioned, the students from Parkland, Florida, who've stood up to the NRA and used tech to disseminate their messages. For many adults, though, the fact that those people are teenagers seems to be grounds for precluding them from participating in political discussions. In fact, M.T. Anderson has written about that, and he argues that intelligence is the last taboo in young adult literature. And I'll quote him here. He writes, "Some adults still balk at the assumption that teenagers are smart and curious." What inspires you to represent teenagers in the way that you do?
Yeah, I like that quote of Tobin's. That's very good. I think that intelligence, to the extent that we know what intelligence is and that we're talking about the same thing when you say intelligence and when I say intelligence, I think that intelligence is not a function of age, but that context and discipline are, right? You have to learn stuff about the world to apply your reasoning ability, and you have to learn how to reason well, that you have to learn some skills about what our reasoning traps are, the motivated reasoning and self-deception and all of the other errors that we can make when we reason, even our inability to understand kind of statistics and population dynamics, and to understand the logical fallacy that A might be B, but B isn't A, all fathers are men, but not all men are fathers, that kind of thing. Those things have to be learned. But there's actually not a whole ton of rules like that are hard and fast rules. They don't take that long to learn, although they might take a lifetime to internalize. And if you have a first-rate intellect, but you lack some context, there will be some things that you can do as well as or better than any grown-up, and some things that you just haven't had the years on Earth to really make sense of. So, for example, you can become a chess prodigy or a math prodigy as a kid because the actual rules, the context of those games, for lack of a better word, are pretty compact. And once you know them, you can build up a really sophisticated edifice from that foundation. Whereas becoming a historian or, with apologies to Doogie Howser, a doctor, is not something that you can really do as a kid, not because you don't have the first-rate intellect to understand the reasoning of historical people and how the forces around them played out, and not because you don't have the first-rate intellect to take a body of knowledge about how the human body works and your own observations and combine them to make an accurate diagnoses, but because you lack the time to acquire that knowledge of history or that knowledge of the human body. You simply can't read enough books in a short enough time to be a 12-year-old historian. You can be a 12-year-old who's intensely curious about history and who knows an awful lot about it, but you are always going to be at a disadvantage relative to the adults in your life. But, I don't think anyone is really surprised anymore when we meet 12-year-olds who are amazing mathematicians or amazing chess players. I mean, they're unusual, but it's not hard to understand, right? They have the mind that's wired for it, and then someone taught them the underlying foundations, and then they built up this praxis through reasoning. And so, I try to make that the soul of my YA characters, that they may be really smart, but that they lack that context. And in some ways, that's just a corollary of what that, mysterious Australian YA writer told me, which is that, before you've told a live consequence, you cannot reason yourself into understanding what that'll feel like. You can make some guesses, but you will never have the full experience until you've done it. There is no substitute for that experience. In fact, that's one of the reasons I think kids read YA fiction, because the closest thing to a substitute for the dangerous and difficult transformations that you go through as a teen is to read about other teens going through them, to have that interiority that a novel can give you. Novels are grounded in the lie that one person can know what another person is thinking, which is not something anyone in the history of the world can ever claim to have done. And, that illusion that you are in someone else's head as they are experiencing these difficult things that loom on your horizon is an incredibly attractive and I think ultimately very soothing idea, because it replaces this information void with at least some stuff that you can make as the basis for some shrewd guesses before you get into trouble yourself.
Okay, so Marcus, who is the protagonist in Little Brother, is precisely the sort of character that you're describing. He's intelligent, extremely insightful, creative. He also appears in the sequel to Little Brother, Homeland, which you published in 2013. In it, Marcus again finds himself the victim of corporate and government surveillance, and there's a moment in the story when he's forced to acknowledge that he'd been naive to think that the world could be better if only, and I'm quoting the novel, we had the right people out there passing good laws and making good government. Another character in the story puts an exclamation point on that epiphany when she tells him, you need to get past this romantic idea of justice and realize that some stuff just is. I have a feeling that the despair Marcus feels in that novel may make some adults uncomfortable. So with that in mind, what would you say to an adult who questions the appropriateness of depicting institutions like government in a negative light in books for young people?
Well, it's important to note that, Marcus's struggle to perfect his government doesn't end when he has that epiphany. It's just that he realizes that law alone or legislation alone or goodwill alone are necessary but insufficient for affecting the kind of change that he wants. As we record this, there was an election concluded yesterday in Canada in which Justin Trudeau, who ran on this super progressive platform and then completely failed to deliver on it, and actually delivered the opposite. He said he would stop the pipeline. He instead, when the pipeline looked like it was in danger of being stopped, he bailed it out with taxpayer money. He said he would address Indigenous truth and reconciliation, and instead he subverted and ended programs for truth and reconciliation, going so far as to sue in court to have judgments made in support of Indigenous causes overturned on behalf of the federal government. He promised this litany of things and wasn't able to deliver on any of them. And some of them, I think that's just the cynicism. But in other cases, I think it reflects the fact that there were great forces pushing against him, both within his party and within his country, and that he lacked the kind of normative social support for these programs and these policies that would have made it easier to enact it. There's this famous New Deal election eve quote, "I want to do it, now make me do it," the president speaking to activists. I think Trudeau and Obama both suffered from the same disease, which was an unwillingness to turn to the rabble who had elected them, a kind of a mistrust of that rabble to help them govern. Unlike, say, the Tea Party, who said, well, we will make ourselves prisoners of the rabble because the rabble will also support our agenda, and who, undoubtedly suffered as a result of it. There are lawmakers who threw up their hands and quit over it. There were good policies that couldn't get passed because the base was holding the key lawmakers' feet to the fire. But, that unwillingness to turn to social movements outside of government was doubtless a fatal error on both Obama and on Trudeau's part. And, getting kids to understand that the law is what happens in many times at the end of the social change, not as the instigator of the social change, that the law is how we formalize the change that we've had in society. That's really important, or even when laws are made, but the society hasn't kept up with those laws are often only enforced when society is dragged along. You can think of something like the Sherman Act, which was passed, at the start of the Gilded Age, as a way of holding billionaires to account and breaking up monopolies, but which was totally unenforced until we got to a point where the Gilded Age became so unstable that suddenly there was social pressure to enforce these laws, that included things like a threat to pack the Supreme Court if they wouldn't uphold decisions under the Sherman Act. And that's when we started to see the breakups of things like Standard Oil and Carnegie Steel and so on. And it illustrates that the idea that law itself is where our social reality comes from, as opposed to this kind of swirl of law and technology and norms and markets. It illustrates the poverty of that view and the importance of having a more nuanced view, because otherwise it's just a counsel of despair, right? You try to get a law passed and it isn't passed, or you get it passed and it isn't enforced. It's very easy to become despairing at that point. But, if you can show what's missing from the law that causes it to be not enforced, you can actually help people keep hope up and also steer them to where they need to put their energy next to continue the struggle that they've gained some ground in.
Okay, so then to build on that, in the books that you write, it's not just governments and corporations that abuse technology. Schools do as well. In fact, you wrote an essay, Beyond Censorware, Teaching Web Literacy, in which you criticize schools for the approach that they take to monitoring students' use of technology. And in it, you argue that the way in which they go about doing so, using software to track and to censor students' online activity, actually undermines their appreciation for the value of privacy.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about why you believe that's the case?
Yeah. So, the kids are very attuned to what grown-ups do, much more so than what we say. And so, the typical privacy discussion in a school goes like this. Your privacy is like your virginity. Once you lose it, you'll never get it back. Don't ever give up your private information. Learn to be literate about who's gathering your information and what they're doing with it. Anticipate the long-run consequences of disclosures and data gathering and so on. So that's, the thing that we tell kids. But what we do to kids is spy on literally everything they do online, whether or not they're in school. The schools are now actually hiring social media monitoring companies that will find students who are off the school premises using their own computers and monitor their social media activity in order to figure out whether or not and how to discipline them, and to build these like non-consensual dossiers on children and what they do when they're socializing away from the schoolyard. And, not only does that work counter to this message that your privacy really matters, your privacy really matters, except when I'm invading it, is a difficult pill to swallow. But it also means that anything that a kid might do to improve their own lives, right? To improve their own information security runs counter to this policy. That if you learn to use a VPN to avoid a censoring firewall, or if you learn to jailbreak your Chromebook to avoid keyloggers and other surveillance tools, or if you learn to disguise what your social media account is and how it's connected to your school, you are suddenly running the risk that you will be disciplined by the school. And that discipline can include things like expulsion and even threats of criminal prosecution under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act for tampering with these access controls. And, if we want kids to learn to be independent and to be good independent thinkers about their digital lives, we can't punish them when they express that independence.
I love that point. And as a follow-up question, what do you think schools could or should be doing to support students learning to use technology in ethical, responsible ways?
I think that right now there's a really terrific learning opportunity for the right teacher in the right school, which is to ask the kids to evaluate and investigate how their data is being collected by the school and its contractors, and whether or not the countermeasures that are supposed to prevent them from doing bad things work, to evaluate them critically, and then to use the tools of a digital activist like freedom of information requests to find out how much their school is spending on it, what kind of commercial arrangements they have, and so on, right? And then to evaluate the efficacy of those tools as well, and to present it to their school districts, their school boards, their parent-teacher associations. So, for example, all the companies that provide censorware for schools, the things that spy on every click you make and determine whether or not to allow it to go through, they don't really have enough of a market in schools to justify that industry. They wouldn't be profitable if they were only serving schools. And those school products, they're actually mostly repackaged products whose primary customers are oppressive regimes, largely in the Middle East. And so what they do is they take the tools that are used by like Bashar al-Assad and they repackage them to spy on children. And that means that you are offshoring every click that every kid in your school makes to basically to war criminals, right? Or at least to the people who supply materiel to war criminals, to cyber arms dealers whose, job is to help maintain some of the most brutal and unethical regimes in not just in the world, but in world history. And, finding out who supplies that to your school and finding out who their other customers are and whether they've been, say, censured by the State Department for abetting these regimes. And then, using FOIA to find out how much your school is giving to these war criminals and investigating what their data handling practices are and parsing through their terms of service and their contracts to find out what they're allowed to do, even if they claim they're not doing it. Because, obviously, if someone claims the right to do something bad and they also have a long and dishonorable track record of doing bad things, but they say, well, don't worry, that's just legal boilerplate. We would never actually do this terrible thing that, we've reserved the right to do. That is an amazing stretch for kids to and for adults. And, it's an opportunity for kids to actually be super literate about what's going on with their technology. And then if you really wanted to do the kind of varsity level version of this, you could also go around and you could do some ethnography or anthropology in your school and find out whether or not kids are actually obstructed from seeing legitimate material in their schools, which they are. These systems, notoriously overblock material, especially material related to LGBT kids, sexual health, and so on. So whether things are being blocked unduly, and also whether or not kids have figured out how to get around them. Because that's the other thing, is that none of this stuff works very well. So, you're not only buying a tool that works badly, you're buying a tool that fails badly. And so being able to go off and say, dear school district and grownups who claim to have our best interests at heart, let me tell you what this giant spend that you've done has accomplished. It's blocked us from seeing all of this really important information, but it's also not stopped people who say want to look at pornography on school districts from actually looking at pornography and potentially harassing their kids. So it's the worst of all worlds.
I love those practices that you're describing. And maybe 2 months ago, I would have thought to myself, boy, I can imagine those sorts of instructional activities making administrators very nervous. But I don't know that I do, because you've said, and this really surprised me, you've said that in the wake of publishing Little Brother, you found teachers and parents and librarians were less troubled by your depicting teenagers using technology to subvert adult authority than they were the fact that the book's protagonist, Marcus, loses his virginity.
Mm-hmm.
Did that surprise you? And what was your response to it?
It did. I mean, so I'm mindful that there are other authors who found themselves here who I'm maybe less sympathetic to. There's a notorious scene in Stephen King's novel It, in which the sole girl protagonist has sex with all of the male protagonists in sequence. And it not only is super gross and sketchy, it's also like it doesn't make any sense in the context of the story. It's just kind of dumb. And King, when he gets called on this, says things like, well, have you read it? It's full of people being dismembered and, tortured and haunted and horribly physically mutilated. And the thing that you're focusing on is the consensual sex between these tweens in this scene. And, I understand why people actually focus on that scene, despite the fact that, as King says, that there's a lot of other stuff in that book that you might want to be concerned about. And that is arguably would be a lot more harmful to kids. I mean, I think that being the sole girl in that situation would be incredibly harmful to you. But as harmful as it is, I don't think it would be as harmful as being dismembered. Like clearly there are greater harms in the book. But I understand where people are coming from. And so, that said, I can have some empathy for teachers and other adults who say, well, I'm worried about this one very non-explicit sex scene, like literally at the end of a long and stable adolescent relationship. These two super mature teenagers have a frank discussion about having sex. They demonstrate that they have birth control, and the lights go off and the chapter ends. And that is the sex scene in the book that adults get worried about. And I don't think that is nearly so troubling as the scene in It, which also It is a novel for adults and not for kids. But kids or adults, I understand where they're coming from when it comes to It. But at the same time, I do think that it shows us that we have extremely misplaced priorities and that they're not distinct to literature. There's a brilliant and important 10-year-old movie by the documentarian Kirby Dick about how the MPAA rates movies, called This Film Is Not Yet Rated. And the MPAA, its movie rating process is totally secretive. They have a secret panel nominally of parents of young kids from the Los Angeles area who meet and deliberate over the ratings that the movies get. And, any even cursory systematic examination of those ratings shows that an unlimited amount of violence is permissible, but very little sex is permissible, and no non-heterosexual sexuality is permissible in movies that kids are allowed to watch. And this is clearly a giant discrepancy in how we think about things. And it does point to a certain Americanness in how we conceive of what is and isn't appropriate for kids. The idea that watching people be dismembered and mutilated is not inappropriate for kids, but watching a loving, healthy relationship between two men or two women or non-binary people is indefensible. And I think that, history will judge us harshly on this. It will seem as weird as, say, the, Victorian prohibition on looking at a woman's ankle or something. It will be very odd indeed. But, clearly it's some like internalized sex phobia and homophobia.
I'd like to shift gears here, and in the time that we have left together, I'd like to talk about another book that you've written for young adults, Pirate Cinema.
Mm-hmm.
I love all of your books. I think it may be my favorite. Before we talk about it, though, could you give listeners who haven't read it a sense of what Pirate Cinema is about?
Sure. It's a book about a United Kingdom. It's set in the UK, in which there is a law that requires internet service providers to take away your household's internet if you receive 3 accusations of copyright infringement. And the law itself is not fictional. It's called the Digital Economy Bill. It passed about 5 years ago. It has yet to be enforced, but it's on the books in the UK. Similar laws on the books in New Zealand and also in France. So in France, it's called Hadopi. In New Zealand, it was called Bill 92A. And in New Zealand, they actually passed it and then had to rescind it after mass street demonstrations, which was remarkable. I mean, you had people just flooding the streets opposed to this legislation. And then after the Christchurch earthquake, during an emergency sitting of Parliament, the parliamentarian who was responsible for the original Bill 92A said that he would block emergency aid to the people under the rubble in Christchurch unless they attached a reestablishment of this disconnection provision to the appropriation, and managed to cram it back through again, which, it shows you just how weird, talking about weird priorities. The idea that, watching TV the wrong way would be such a scourge that we would be willing to hold up aid to people in the rubble of a terrible natural disaster, the literal rubble of a terrible natural disaster, shows you just how weird and distorted our priorities are. And at the time, New Zealand's second largest industry after financial secrecy and money laundering was filmmaking. It was Peter Jackson. And, this member of parliament, they sometimes called him the MP from the Shire. He was there representing the interests of this one giant film company. And, it's just one of the many ways in which our policies have been distorted by one-sided debate about copyright and copyright enforcement on the internet. And so in this world, in this world of pirate cinema, there's a kid who lives in a housing project whose family are completely dependent on the internet. His sister can't go to school and do her homework without the internet. His mom can't sign on for benefits for her career-ending physical disabilities without the internet. His dad can't do the gig economy work that he does from home without the internet. And this kid is a filmmaker. And just like filmmakers before him, the way that he is learning to make movies is by tearing apart and putting back together the movies of his favorite filmmakers. Just like kids practice music by playing their favorite music. And because of this, his family gets disconnected from the internet. And it effectively amounts to an economic death sentence. And he becomes a kind of neo-Dickensian fugitive. He runs away to London from this town in the north and leaves his family in shame and falls in with a group of guerrilla filmmaker squatters. And they work to create a kind of demimonde in which they make illegal art and screen it in underground movie theaters that are literally underground in the old sewers, Victorian sewers of London. And through them, they foment a political movement that comes together to resist and ultimately to overturn a new legislative solution, because it turns out that disconnecting people from the internet doesn't make them stop copying stuff, because nothing ever will. And so now they're creating long custodial sentences, prison sentences for people who are caught watching TV the wrong way. And they successfully block this legislation and become a political force within British politics.
There's a scene in pirate cinema when a character highlights a whole series of problems that she associates with copyright law. She tells the book's protagonist, Trevor, "Do you know that 90% of the film copyrights in the whole history of the planet belong to 5 studios? And the 8 companies control 85% of the world's radio, TV, film, newspapers, book publishing, and internet publishing? Those companies own all our culture, and they get to make anything they want with it. The rest of us have to break the law to do what they do all the time. But it's everyone's culture. That's the whole point, right? Once you put it out into the world, it's the world's. It's part of the stories we tell each other to make sense of life." I share that vision 100%, but I wonder, what would you say to someone who argues that the rights of creators have to be protected in order to ensure that they're able to earn a living from the art that they produce?
Well, I would say that they're not doing much to protect those rights. That that passage. It turns out that I was very wrong about that passage, because now it's 4 movie studios and 6 entertainment conglomerates that control the world's culture.
So that's factually true.
Oh, yeah.
That is factually true.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I mean, it's not, right? Because it was optimistic. It assumed that we would have less industry concentration by now. But yes, it's factually true that that's the concentrated regime we live in. And, when you have a buyer's market for art, for the labor of artists, the buyers are able to cheat the sellers, the artists themselves. So, music industry revenues, for example, have rebounded to inflation adjusted levels that are better than they were before Napster came along. But the share of income going to artists is so low that artists are earning less money than they were as on the median back when that was happening. And so that's where we've ended up. And, we can talk all we want about industrial policies that give us leverage over our fans. But it's a kind of mug's game to try and terrorize or shame your fans into supporting you. You kind of have to sweet talk them into it by convincing them that if they buy things or pay for them, that they will be supporting the art that they love. And I think a lot of people, when they say, well, I don't want to pay for the media that I love because it's all just going to end up in the pockets of some hedge fund that owns it, it's not just a convenient rationalization. It also happens to be true in the main. Every screenwriter in Hollywood, so I'm talking to you from Burbank, so I can walk out my door and within half an hour be at the gates of Universal, Warner, or Disney. And every screenwriter in this city has fired their agent. And the reason they fired their agents is there's only 3 talent agencies left, and they're all owned by hedge funds. And the hedge funds have created a rule that they will do these packaging deals for talent, where if you are hired on as a writer, your agency will also provide actors and directors and so on, and that they will collect a packaging fee for this, and that they will be willing to accept less money for their talent in exchange for the packaging fee that goes to the hedge funds that own these talent agencies. So every member of the guild, every unionized screenwriter in Hollywood, which is to say anyone who's ever sold a screenplay, has now fired their agent, and it's been months in the running. So, focusing on our audiences who are struggling with the same forces that we are of market concentration, whose coffee shop was forced out of business by Starbucks and cost them their barista job, or whose glasses have gone up 1,000% because a single company, Luxottica, owns every eyewear brand and every eyewear retailer in America. So, LensCrafters and Oakley and Sunglass Hut and Sears Optical and Target Optical and Essilor, the largest lab in the world for making lenses and contact lenses, and IMED, the largest insurer in the country that insures eyewear. They're all owned by one hedge fund-backed Italian company, and they've raised the prices of glasses 1,000% in a decade, or whose insulin costs 1,000% more than it did 5 years ago because of consolidation in the pharmaceutical industry. All of those people, they share our concerns that we are in a seller's market or buyer's market for our labor and a seller's market for the things that we need, and that our costs are going up and our incomes are going down as a consequence of market concentration and inequality. In California, the largest landlord is a hedge fund. It's the largest hedge fund in the world. It's Blackstone. They bought all of the distressed properties that people had stolen from them after the 2008 real estate crisis, when the banks came and used robo-signing to steal the houses of people who'd taken mortgages out. And now those hedge fund landlords have raised rents to the point where they've climbed from 30% of the median income to more than 50% of the median income, while at the same time slashing maintenance. So people are having to pay for their own mold abatement so that they don't get respiratory diseases from the mold creeping up their walls. And so, those people are pissed off at the same things we are as artists. But the idea that we will solve our problem by allowing ourselves to be divided on our class interests and to see the problem as our audiences and not as the same corporations whose shareholders are screwing us and them, it's a huge mistake. If you want to make sure that as an artist your income is defended, what you really want to do is make sure that there is a big competitive market for your art. So, in the last year, the European Union enacted a rule nominally to protect artists' incomes as part of its new copyright directive, Article 17 of the Copyright Directive, that requires that anyone who provides a platform where the public can communicate also has to prevent anything that might infringe copyright from going live, even momentarily. That it's not enough to respond to complaints about copyright infringement, that you have to proactively police everything everyone says. Now, practically what that means is that everyone has to implement filters where anyone can say, this is my copyright, put it in the filter, and then anything that the world tries to make available through any of the big platforms is checked to see whether it matches anything in that filter database, and they're blocked if they do. Now, that filter, there are no penalties for uploading things to those filters that don't infringe copyright or whose copyright actually belongs to someone else. So someone else can claim credit for your work and monetize that work and prevent you from uploading it under this regime. So clearly that's very bad for independent artists. Not so much for studios. The studios can figure out how to sue, or, they'll have these back channels into the big tech platforms that they can use to sort out these disputes. But you're going to have to get in line behind 10 million other people whose material was mistakenly flagged that day by one of these filters. Now, at the same time, the filters are incredibly expensive, right? The closest we have to that filter is the Content ID filter used on YouTube, which only addresses a small block of content and only video content, as opposed to all text, audio, video, source code, and so on. That costs $100 million to build and maintain. There's only about 5 tech companies in the world that can afford that. And so what we're effectively saying is that Facebook, Google, Apple, and a few other companies are going to be the perpetual masters of the internet. So even if you can claw your copyrights back from your studio, you're now going to be negotiating with one of 5 giant companies who are going to be no better and probably no worse than the 5 giant movie studios or the 5 giant record labels or the 5 giant publishers that you clawed your work back from. So it's meet the new boss, same as the old boss, and it's all being done in the name of preserving artist revenues. Now, if you actually did want to preserve artist revenues and you wanted to make copyright that was about making sure that artists got paid rather than making sure that a small number of corporations got to dominate all of the channels by which art was made and disseminated, you could instead do something like say, all right, anyone who has a platform needs to take a license to copyrighted works. It's a blanket license administered by an arm's length independent body that is open to public scrutiny and is accountable the way that our best of breed public bodies are. They will sample what's being shared on the internet, and they will pay out royalties to artists and to the labels that and studios and publishers who make their works available. And that license will be commensurate with the number of users you have. So Facebook has 2.3 billion users. They will pay 2.3 billion times more than your service with only 1 user. And as you add users, the license payment goes up, but only in lockstep with the amount of users that you have so that you can compete on a level playing field with Facebook. And nothing that Facebook has will be exclusive to their platform. At the same time, we can build and enhance the kinds of reversion clauses that are in U.S. copyright law. So under U.S. copyright law, after 35 years, regardless of what your contractual arrangement with your studio label or publisher says, you can claw back your copyrights by filing paperwork. You can just file paperwork and say, all of that stuff that I signed away for life, I'm getting it back now. And so then you would get 100% of those revenues from those statutory licenses, right? So those 2 things would enhance artists without enhancing the corporations that dominate artists' incomes and are taking a larger and larger share of artists' incomes. But those weren't even on the table when we were talking about copyright reform in Europe. Instead, we ended up with this bullshit policy that was endorsed by artist groups across Europe that threatens not just the income of the arts, but all human expression, because as the characters in Pirate Cinema learn, the internet is not a glorified video on demand service. It's the digital planetary species-wide nervous system for everything we do in this century. And suborning our ability to have a political discourse or to have a romantic or personal life to our ability to be scrutinized and to have our communications approved by a black box filter operated by a giant global multinational is an incredibly terrible idea. And any artist who endorses that in the parochial belief that it might feather their nest a little should be ashamed of themselves. They are on the wrong side of free expression, the wrong side of the arts, and the wrong side of history.
I always wonder, how does one know they're living in a dystopia? But listening to you describe the problems that consolidation has created, I'm fairly certain that we are living in a dystopia right now. I'm fairly certain.
Well, I'll tell you what gives me hope, right? So this is the thing about dystopias, is that we tend to confuse things that have utopian furniture with actual dystopias, right? Things where stuff has gone really bad. And I think a dystopia is it's not a place where we've had some terrible catastrophic problems, because those happen even to well-designed systems. It's where we can't solve those problems. So The Road is a legit dystopia, right? Because The Road is not just a place where things have gone wrong. It's a place where, the incredible venality and untrustworthiness of humans and our unworthiness as a species dooms us to never being able to fix them. And, in that book, we never find out what it was that allowed humans to solve those problems in the first place and what it is that we've lost now. It's a very lapsarian title in that it's a book about us somehow having fallen from grace so that we can no longer do what we've done over the long sweep of history. And so I think that what is hopeful is not to imagine that things won't break down, but that we can fix them when it's done. And one of the things that gives me hope is the very shared nature of this problem that artists have, that whether you care about eyewear or whether you care about screenwriting or whether you care about insulin, or, even if you care about pro wrestling, right? There used to be 30 pro wrestling leagues. Now there's one. The monopolist who owns that pro wrestling league reclassified all of his performers as contractors and took away their health care. And now famous wrestlers who are beloved by millions are dropping dead in their 50s and begging for money for their medical bills on GoFundMe. And all of these people are potential co-constituents for a movement to enact reform, right? Just as before the term ecology was coined, you had people who cared about whales and people who cared about owls and people who cared about the ozone layer, but no solidarity among them. We are on the cusp of a moment in which we are going to coin a term, and maybe it'll be pluralism or anti-monopolism or trust busting. And in that moment, we are going to be able to affect a massive change because we will all be fighting for the same thing, even though we care about different aspects of it.
Well, and that's what makes your book so important, is that you offer young people a blueprint of sorts, right? That they can follow to address some of the problems that we've been talking about.
I think to the extent that I do something a little different to other people, it's that when I talk about what the technology can and can't do and what kinds of solutions we can imagine and which ones we can't, I tend to stay pretty close to the understood basis of current computer science without trying to invent new things that don't and probably won't exist, like cryptography that works only when we need it to, but fails suddenly when we don't, or computers that only run some programs, but not the ones that we don't like. All of those things are pretty stable in the history of computer science. And as is our inability to kind of cope with the ramifications of those problems or those capabilities. And, by making those the center of the narrative, it gives it a kind of staying power because, those problems, the problems depicted in Little Brother may never come to pass, but problems like them will, because fundamentally we're talking about what computers can and can't do.
Hey, one last question, Cory, and I'll let you get out of here.
Sure.
Am I correct in understanding that you've got a contract for a third book in the Little Brother series?
That's right. Yeah. We haven't announced the title yet, but yes, there's a third book. It'll be for adults. And it's a book about the character Masha, who appears at the beginning and the end of the other two books, who is someone who is, sympathetic to the cause of the characters in those books, but who ultimately ends up working first for the DHS and then for a military contractor, an intelligence contractor. And it's about her journey and how people who may be sympathetic to the cause nevertheless talk themselves into doing something really terrible. There's a politician I used to like and respect in Europe who, after they were voted out of office, took a job fronting one of the worst corporations in the world. My understanding is that they're getting 4 million euros a year to do it. And, that buys a lot of motivated reasoning.
Do you have a sense of when that book might come out?
I think it's mid or late 2020 or early 2021.
Oh, man, I can't wait.
I have one more round of edits for it.
Oh, so you've written it?
Oh, yeah.
Wow, I can't wait for that. Hey, thank you for taking time. I know how much traveling and speaking and work that you do, so thank you so much for taking time to talk with me.
Oh, no, it's absolutely my pleasure. Thanks for your interest in my work. I appreciate it.
And with that, we've reached the end of our time together. As always, thanks for listening to this podcast. And a special thank you to Cory for making time to come on and talk with me about his work. If you haven't read his books, the good news is you still have time to rectify that. In fact, he has a new novel for adults, Radicalized, that's in bookstores now. Whether you're planning to travel for the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday or just lounge around home, it'll give you something to read and occupy yourself. And speaking of the holiday, have a happy Thanksgiving. I hope you get to spend the day with people that you love and care about, and who love and care about you too. As for me, I'll look forward to seeing you back here in December, when we'll continue to talk about the craft of storytelling for young adults. Till then, happy reading.